philosophy and religion. She's a modern European historian, and her main specialty is modern German history. She's got research interests in World War I, era of consumer culture, national identity, censorship, and gender. She's currently completing a book tentatively entitled Battling Buffalo Bill, Anti-Trash Activism and Censorship in the Early 20th Century, in early 20th century Germany.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the citizen-state relationships changing the perspective. World War I was without a doubt one of the most transformative experiences of the modern age, as we've heard. From a political perspective, 4 years of fighting produced a dramatic redrawing of national borders in Europe. Less because armies claimed extensive new territories, and more because the Russian, German, Austrian, and Ottoman empires all collapsed. In their place emerged new nation-states, countries like Poland, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The war also radically transformed people's expectations of war. In the first weeks of fighting in August 1914, men and women across Europe famously anticipated that this conflict would be over in just a few months, in time for soldiers to be home for Christmas. In fact, the war lasted 52 months. Families experienced lengthy separations, civilians suffered shortages, hardship, and in some cases, occupation and forced labor policies. The war also changed expectations about the brutality of war. The flamethrower, poison gas, tanks, aerial bombings, and submarine warfare were all used for the first time during World War I. The line between civilian and soldier collapsed as military and civilian leaders adopted the policies of total war, redirecting every human, material, and natural resource towards winning the war. And increasingly, they recognized attrition as an acceptable path toward victory. This type of strategy produced battles like Verdun and the Somme, which resulted in unimaginable casualty numbers, like 60,000 British soldiers killed in one day of fighting. World War I also forced both soldiers and civilians to confront death, massive death, as well as disfiguring and debilitating injuries. By the time the war was over in November of 1918, nearly 7 million European men had been killed by combat. Approximately 16 million had been wounded. Parents, wives, and children worked to come to terms with this loss, some turning even to seances and spiritual photography in a desperate struggle to see their loved ones again. This confrontation with pervasive death, people at the time worried, and historians have since suggested, would desensitize soldiers and fuel post-war brutality. There are obviously several angles by which to take measure of the impact World War I had on Europe and the international community, as is evidenced by our panel today. I'd like to shift our focus ever so slightly and talk about the impact war had on the development of state structures we would identify as modern, particularly the structure of social welfare, and how these transformations emerged out of new ideas about what types of rights and duties citizens enjoyed, particularly citizens who had suffered through 4 years of sacrifice and hardship. In other words, the war changed popular understandings of what relationships existed between citizens and the state. And we can see this transformation most clearly in changes that took place within social welfare, both during and after the war. And given my own research interests, I am going to use Germany as my example. I'd like to begin by very generally taking stock of what Europe looked like in terms of the citizen-state relationship prior to 1914. In the early 1900s, European countries possessed many characteristics that we normally associate with the modern state. Since the mid-19th century, many states had adopted political reforms that extended voting rights to more groups and created democratic institutions, like parliaments, with appreciable authority to a degree. Many states had also worked to extend their bureaucratic capacity and expand their areas of responsibility. By 1900, for example, several governments were actively providing public education, regulating labor, producing civil codes and legal codes, investing in infrastructure, and in the case of Germany, even creating a federal social insurance scheme for workers. Simultaneously, by the early 20th century, citizens who lived in these countries had an increasing sense of their individual rights, such as free speech, freedom of religion, and equality before the law, as well as their political rights, such as the right to vote and the right to assemble. Starting in the mid-1800s, or even earlier, there was a growing understanding of social rights, such as the right to a job, an adequate living, and adequate support during times of unemployment, particularly as industrialization gained momentum. But for the most part, there was no widespread consensus in society that citizens enjoyed individual, political, and social rights. To summarize, in the early 1900s, Europe was for the most part populated by governments that were modernizing and assuming a greater presence in people's lives, and citizens who were fluent in the language of rights. The citizen-state relationship that existed at this point, I would argue, was a reflection of 19th century liberalism that emphasized the individual. In terms of welfare, this theory quite often held that poverty was an individual problem, and in many cases a consequence of laziness, moral failing, or character flaws. This attitude impacted welfare policy. In many cases, federal and local governments provided minimal aid to the most needy, oftentimes requiring a needs test. They relied on charities and religious groups to supplement their efforts. Although progressives were increasingly suggesting that material and social circumstances produce poverty and need, not individual failing, this had not become the pervasive attitude. World War I radically transformed attitudes towards welfare and the need for preventive social welfare programs. Mobilization policies produced need among groups that had never before experienced it. In Germany, over 13 million men served in the war. Of this number, a third were married, and somewhere between 4 and 6 million were fathers. Whether they volunteered or were conscripted, when these men deployed, their families lost both a father and a breadwinner. In Germany, the federal government responded by providing separation allowances to wives and children. Nearly immediately, the outbreak of war led also to an increase in unemployment, particularly as industries designated as non-essential were shut down. And so in the first month of war, the German government committed to providing aid to these groups. The government also made a commitment to provide disability pensions to severely wounded soldiers, as well as survivor payments to widows and orphans. By the last part of the war, somewhere between 30 to 50% of the German population was dependent on state support. As the war came to an end, over 700,000 veterans were receiving disability pensions. Another 800,000 had received a lump sum payout. And 1.6 million people were receiving survivor benefits, and this includes widows, orphans, and parents who had lost their sons. Another 1 million people, many of them once members of the middle classes, were also receiving aid, in many cases because war and inflation had destroyed their savings, their pensions, and their investments. The war produced need on a scale so massive that only the federal government could provide it. Whereas once charitable groups and religious organizations had played a key role, welfare was now being increasingly professionalized. War greatly expanded the number of people needing aid, and it also altered the demands citizens could make on the state. Veterans, widows, and orphans could point to their enormous losses to demand that the government honor their sacrifices with stronger welfare programs. More and more citizens asserted their right to what they called the social existence minimum. That is, support that would not be need-based or somehow impact them negatively from a legal standpoint. More and more citizens were becoming fluent in the language of social rights. The transformation in the state-citizenship relationship brought by war can be seen in what happened after the war, particularly in Germany. In November of 1918, in a train car in France, Germany signed the armistice sealing its defeat. Back home in Germany, a revolt among sailors and workers that began in Kiel spread throughout the country. Germany's Kaiser, or king, abdicated his throne as civilian leaders scrambled to introduce democratic reforms that would be acceptable to President Woodrow Wilson, Germany's best hope for a workable peace. In early November, German political leaders declared the creation of a new republic. In January 1919, elected delegates met in the city of Weimar to write a new constitution. The three largest parties present there were committed to transforming Germany into a parliamentary democracy, as well as a pioneering social welfare state. The new Weimar Constitution of 1919 identified popular sovereignty as the source of state power, and it contained a section detailing citizens' rights and duties. Among these were individual rights, like freedom of religion and equality before the law for both men and women. The Constitution also guaranteed individuals' social rights. Article 161, for example, promised that the federal government would create a comprehensive insurance scheme in order to, what they said, quote, maintain health and working capacity, to protect motherhood, and to provide against the economic consequences of old age, infirmity, and the vicissitudes of life. In my own work, I am fascinated by how the framers of this Constitution married social rights with political rights, and in some cases prioritized social rights over individual rights. I would argue that there were aspects of this Constitution, notably the absence of judicial review of legislative new law, which made this a dangerous combination for the health and vitality of German democracy. The war had played a fundamental role, though, in persuading citizens that they had social rights. But political pragmatism and negotiation had led to a constitution that guaranteed these rights at the expense of classic individual rights. Nonetheless, the imprint of war on Germany and the citizen-state relationship is clearly visible in this document. War had created a general consensus that citizens possess social rights, and they compelled the federal government to modernize its approach to law.